Welcome Friday night, Fright fans. I am your host, Lord Byron. No makeup today because we're doing something a little bit special. Care to know what it is? Oh, we are going to be looking at a classic today. I thought I would read Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow. My father is a big fan of Washington Irving and all of his works. Knew them inside and out, he did. So, with October being one of his favorite months, as well as Halloween, I thought I would share the story of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It is based on actual facts about the colonial town of Sleepy Hollow, populated mainly by the Dutch in Sleepy Hollow, New York. So sit back, grab some popcorn, turn out the lights, and enjoy the story of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of the once spacious coves in which descend the eastern shore of the Hudson, at the broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators of Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail, implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed. There lies a small market town in a rural port, which by some is called Greensboro, by which is more generally and popularly known by the name of Tarrytown. The name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country from the inverate propensity of their husbands to linger about in the village and tavern on market days, hence the word tarry. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Nor far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is but a little valley, or rather lap of land, among the high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, and just murmur enough to fill to one's repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or a tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that when stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in the grove of the tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature was precisely quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness sound, and was prolonged, reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat, whether I might steal from the world or from the distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know for none more promising than this little valley. For the listless repose of the place and the particular character and its inhabitants, there are descendants from the original Dutch settlers. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. And its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring county. A Dorsey dreaming influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade a very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, an old Indian chief and prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. That's where you get the name Hudson River from. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some switching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in the continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and subject to trances and visions, and sequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds in local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare, often across the valley than in any other part of the country. And the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make a favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, however, haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air in its aspiration to figure on horseback without a head. And is said by one to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever the Anion seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, and in the wings of the wind, his haunts nor confined to the valley, to extend at times the adjacent roads, especially to the vicinity of the church at great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful to collect and collating and floating facts concerning the specter, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth in the scene of battle a nightly quest for his head. And the rushing speed in which sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owning to his belated and hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general support of the legendary superstition, which has finished materials of many of wild stories in the region of shadows. The specter is known at the country and in all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered into the sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is such a little retired Dutch, in such retired Dutch valleys, round here and there, embosomed in the great state of New York, the population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration, the improvement which is making such insistent changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, and slowly resolve in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Therefore many years have been elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees, the same family, vegetating in the sheltered bosom. And by this place a nature there abode in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy height of the name Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed, tarried in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children in the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen, countrymen, schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served as shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat on top, with huge ears, long green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, to that which it looked like a weathercock perched upon the spindle of his neck, to tell which way the wind may blow. To see him striding along the profile of a hill in a windy day, with his clothes banging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of a famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building on a one large room, rudely constructed of logs, windows partially glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most indigenously secured at vacant hours by a white twistle in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that though the thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. The idea most probably borrowed from an architect, Joost van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, and formidable birch trees growing at the end of it, from which the low murmur of his pupils' voices coning over the lessons might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, and in a tone of minutes in command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of a birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maximum, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars were not spoiled. He would not have imagined, however, that he was one of the cruel potentates of the school, who joy in the smart of their subjects. On contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burthen of the backs of the weak and laying it upon those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin who sulked and swelled and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. And this he called doing his duty by their parents. And he never inflicted chastisement without following it with assurance so consolatory to the smarting urchin that he would remember it and thank him for the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate to the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. And indeed it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils, the revenue assuring him that the school was small and would have been securely suffices them to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of farmers whose children he instructed. With those he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too erroneous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden and schoolmasters as mere drones. He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mended the fences, looked for horses to water, or took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity of the absolute sway in which he lorded it in his little empire, the school. He became wonderfully gentle in grading. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bold which Willem so magnanimously the lamb did hold. He would sit with a child on his knee and rock the cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was a singing master in the neighborhood. He picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folk in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to make his station in front of the church valley with a band to choose singers, where in his own mind he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain in his voice resounded far above the rest of the congregation. There are particular quivers still to be heard in the church, in which even may be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, were to be said legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts of indigenous way, is commonly dominated by book and by crook, in the worthy pedagogue, not on tolerably enough, and was, though, by all who understood nothing in the labor of head work, to have wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of rural neighborhood, being considered a kind and idle gentleman-like personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments of rush country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His acceptance therefore is apt to occasion some little stir of tea at the table of a farmhouse, in addition to a supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters therefore was peculiarity, I have a hard time with that word, sorry, in the smiles of the country damsels, who was figured among them in the churchyard between services of Sunday, of Sunday gatherings, of Sundays, gathering grapes from them in the wild vines, and overrun the surrounding trees, reacting for their amusement of all epitaphs of the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them among the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more blushful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, ever saying his superior element and address. From his half internate life also was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying a whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was moreover esteemed, local gossip was always greeted with satisfaction. He was moreover esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite thorough, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, was most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an old mixture of small shrewdness and simple crudity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it was equally extraordinary, and both had increased by his residence of spellbound religion. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover, bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales until the gathering dusk of the evening made a printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wandered his way by swamp, by stream, and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, ever sound of nature at that witching hour flooded his excitement, imagination, and the moan of a whippoorwill from the hillside. And boarding cries of the tree toad, that harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, and the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds, frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of the uncommon brightness would stream across his path, and if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost, and with the idea he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource of such occasions either to drown through or dive away from evil spirits was to sing psalm tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat in their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody, linked sweetness long drawn out, floating from the distant hill along the dusty road. Along his source of fearful pleasures was the past long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning in the fire by the row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, listened to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as sometimes he was called. He would delight them eloquently with the anecdotes of witchcraft and the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds of the air which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon the comets and the shooting stars, and the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn around, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. And there was a pleasure in all this while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of the chamber that was all of the ruddy glow of the crackling wood fire. And there, of course, no specter dared to show his face, and was clearly purchased by the terror of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and the shadows beset his path amidst the dim, ghastly glare of the snowy night? With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window? How often was he applied by some shrub covered with snow, like a sheeted specter beset him every path? How often did he shrink with a curdling awe at the sound of his own steps in the frosty crust beneath his feet, the dread to look over his shoulder, lest he would behold some uncouth being trampled close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among the trees, and the idea that it was a galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. All these, however, were met in terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind, the walk in darkness, through though he had seen many spectres in his time, and had seen that one beset by Satan in diverse shapes in his lowly preambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils. And he would have passed pleasant life of it, and despite of the devil and all his works, in his path not being crossed by a being that caused more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts and goblins, and the whole race of witches upon witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of the substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was withal a little coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress. She was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, at most suited to set off her charms. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Sardom, and tempting stomacher of the golden time, and with all the provokedly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country around. That was pretty risque for its time. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, in his true sent either his eyes or his thought towards the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piqued himself upon the healthy abundance rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are also fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread in the broad branches over it, and the foot of which bubbled upon the spring of the softness and the sweetness of water, and in a little well formed a barrel, then the pole sparkling away through the grass, and a neighborhood brook that bubbled among alders and dwarf willows. Heart of the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church, every window and crevice in which seemed bristling forward with the treasures, we turn the page, of the farm, and the fail and bustling resounding within the Within from morning to night, swallows and martins skim twittering without the eaves, and rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up and watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing, and bowling with their dames, were enjoying the sunshine of the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers from grunting and a response in abundance of the pens, when sallied forth now and then troops of suckling pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in the adjoining pond, conveying whole fleet of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling throughout the farmyard. And the guinea fowls fretting about like an ill-tempered housewives, their sheepish, disconnected cry. Wherefore the barn door strutted a gallant cock, the pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowning in the pride of gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon his sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In the devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with puttering in his belly and the apple in his mouth, and pigeons were snugly put to bed, and the comfortable pie, and tucking in the coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in the dishes like snug married couples with decent competency of onion sauce. And the porkers with the saw carved out of the future sleek side of bacon, and the juicy relishing ham, not a turkey, but beheld daintily trussed up in the gizzard under its wing, and pejurance, a necklace of savory sausages, even brought Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his neck, and in the side dish with uplifted claws, and in a craving that quarter which his chivalrous squirt disdained, the whole while living. As the ruptured Ichabod fancied all of this, as he rolled the great green eyes over the fat meadowlands and rich fields of wheat and rye and buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards burthened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the farm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains. His imagination expanded with the idea of how he might readily turn into cash and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingled palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realizing his hopes, presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children mounted on the top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles and dangling beneath, and he beheld himself best riding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out to Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of the most spacious farmhouses with high-ridged, but lowly sloped roofs, building in the style of handed down from the first Dutch settlers. The low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets, nor for finishing the neighboring river. Benches building along the sides of summer use, and being spinning wheel at one end of the churn or the other, showing various uses in which was important to the porch that might be devoted. From the piazza and wondering from this piazza, the wandering Ichabod entered into the hall, which formed the center of the mansions and the place of unusual residence. Here, rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one of the corners stood a huge bag of wool ready to be spun, and in another a quality of linsey woolsey, just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the god of red peppers. The door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs of dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors, and the irons of the accompanying shovel and tongs glistened from their covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored bird eggs were suspended like it, and great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard knowingly left open, displaying immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. See how much further we have to go. Oh goodness. We will leave it at that on page 340. We will continue the story next week, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I hope that you enjoyed this tale. This is one of my favorite stories, and it will forever be a favorite. Much different than what you may have heard from, let's say, more popular versions of Sleepy Hollow. This is written in more of an Old English style. So I hope you enjoyed it. Less scary, but more enriching indeed. Have a good night, my friends. Sleep well. Dream of the less haunting things. Stay tuned next week for Friday Night Frights.